Hey, we're back to keep talking because, maybe there's some people we haven't offended yet. So let's take one more lap around the let me offend you swing set and see if we can pick up any
Uh,
stragglers. Caitlin, how would you like to offend anyone?
no, I would not like to offend
No,
anyone.
you don't want to
That's not the
offend anyone?
goal. Sometimes it happens, but this shouldn't be your goal.
Okay, Sky, you were making a point after we stopped recording, and we thought we should jump back in and talk about it some more.
Okay, so you cited this article in the Atlantic by Daniel Williams, history
Yes,
professor from University of West Georgia, who
yes,
talked about how the pro-life movement moved from a northern Catholic concern to a southern evangelical concern, and what changed with that migration.
yep,
Um, because of Catholic social teaching, the pro-life movement was always linked to sort of comprehensive social reform, meaning we need better welfare, we need better education, we need care for the poor, we need all those support structures that would support a family or a woman who's pregnant so that they don't have to pursue or feel they have to pursue an abortion. When it moved into the South, especially with its evangelical emphasis, there wasn't any of that corporate vision of theology. Evangelical theology tends to be hyper individualistic. It's about your personal relationship with God, your personal salvation. And so it got decoupled from those social justice teachings. And here's a quote by Dr. Williams I think is helpful. He says, as the anti abortion movement's political influence shifted away from Catholic states towards evangelical Protestant regions, it abandoned its earlier call for federal anti poverty programs, expanded maternal health insurance, and federally funded daycare, and instead focused exclusively on the narrower issue of overturning Roe v. Wade and making abortion illegal. That's where we now find ourselves, is the same political operatives who are trying to overturn Roe are also against these social policies that would help fewer women pursue an abortion in the first place. So that's a lot of the problem we're going into, and it's rooted in this evangelical theology that's hyper individualistic. So it's
right.
an interesting conundrum when you think about it.
It is, and he even points that out. What does he say? He says, as late as the beginning of this century, Texas still had a pro-abortion rights Protestant Republican senator, while Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Minnesota all had representatives in Congress that were anti-abortion Democrats who were Catholic. But as the historically Catholic population of the North became less devout and therefore less inclined to follow the church's teaching on abortion, and as younger generation of progressive Democrats began to view reproductive rights as a non-negotiable part of the Democratic Party platform, anti-abortion influence in the politically liberal states of the Northeast diminished while it expanded in the South. Only a minority of white evangelical Protestants were politically progressive. The majority, especially in the South, were conservative, and they combined their commitment to moral regulation with a faith in free market economics and opposition to social welfare spending. American evangelicalism had long been the most individualistic of the nation's Christian traditions. And in keeping with that individualistic theology of sin and salvation, most white evangelicals thought the government's interest in morality extended only to the punishment of individual sin, not the reduction of poverty. That's where it broke. That's where the Catholic call to holistic flourishing was taken over by the evangelical call to, don't do bad stuff and take care of your own.
That's so interesting because even just when you were talking, Sky, I was thinking like some of the things that you're saying sound like the opposition a lot of evangelicals will have to like CRT or social justice sort of thing. Like,
Right.
have we ended up putting ourselves on really untenable theological ground because we thought that we could, in one area, when it came to race or just larger social justice questions, we could have a really terrible theology that doesn't allow us to address those issues and then turn around and address this other systemic problem of culture and storytelling and like the whole kind of system under which abortion makes sense is a problem that needs to be addressed with a theology that thinks more systemically as well as individually, but also thinks about communities and cultures. We did one thing over here and I think it really hurts us over here instead of having that holistic sense of, okay, it's going to commit you to both sets of things. I think that's one of the the things that's mentioned in this Tish Harrison Warren piece as well, is like, you can't do one without the other. You can't be really holistically against abortion without thinking about social justice. And we've separated into camps that think they can pick one or the other. And it hurts the more social justice oriented people that want to be pro-choice. It hurts them too, because abortion often has really negative effects on
Right.
poor communities. Like, you really can't separate those two things. But when it becomes an ideological question and not a theological question, that we don't have the most robust foundation for it, we're just kind of swayed by whatever our community says is right, we end up with a really incoherent theology on one side or the other.
Yeah, and that's all. To take a step back from the immediate presenting issue of abortion, this is exactly why we need to be taking our lead from scripture and the historic theology of the church
Yeah.
rather than from our political parties, because it just
Oh,
leads to all kinds of bizarre contradictions and inconsistencies and hypocrisies, frankly, if you go with either political party's views rather than starting with
right.
scripture and letting the
Yep.
chips fall where they may.
I mentioned during the main show that there's a role that racism played in this in the South, where one of the reasons, and to unpack that further, Southern senators didn't want to vote for unemployment insurance when Roosevelt was pushing it in the 1930s, because they didn't want it to apply to African Americans. Because African Americans in the South were doing almost all of the agricultural work and the domestic work in people's homes, and they were so poorly paid that there was a concern they might actually make more from unemployment insurance under FDR
Right.
than we're paying them to pick our cotton and take care of our children. And when Northern senators said, no, we're not going to, the first proposal from Southern senators was, well, let's have a lower rate of compensation if you're black in unemployment insurance. And Northern senators said, no, we're not going to do that. The response was, okay, then exclude agricultural workers and domestic workers, so they don't get anything. And that was the compromise that got passed, which is why to this day, agricultural workers and domestics do not get unemployment insurance, because that was were the jobs that African Americans had in the South, and Southern senators wouldn't vote for it. But that's not all of it, because then you also have the Southwest. You have the Goldwater Republicans, and you had the Reagan era Marlboro man. I'm a cowboy on the prairie. Don't mess with me. I don't want the government touching my stuff. And the Goldwater conservatives were horribly opposed and offended by government help. Like, Americans shouldn't need help. We are self-made men. This is going to undermine the strength of the country. So and that's why Goldwater swept the far South, because he was opposed to the government messing with people's stuff, which included desegregating schools, busing, all the things that the South didn't like. They were standing up for it on a states' rights program, and Goldwater said, that's me. I'm all for states' rights. And then Reagan came along and did the exact same thing, and it made this coalition of libertarian conservatives who maybe had never even met a black person because they were from Arizona or other states that didn't have a plantation economy or a big industrial base, and then the Southern conservatives who were in the middle of Jim Crow and still hanging on to Jim Crow. And that combination was so anti-federal government that once that combination of people took over the pro-life movement, you had to combine, we really care about the unborn, but we don't want the government to get involved in our lives in any way. And that made a really strange, combination that drove people out of the Republican Party who cared about holistically addressing poverty, for example.
Yeah, but you're absolutely right, Phil. I agree with your
You
assessment.
better, you better say I'm
I
right.
totally. But I
You
think
just said but, though. You just said
well,
but.
and it's not a but about what you said. It's a but about
Oh,
where we are right now. I think there were
okay.
probably a lot of Republican political leaders, state and national level, who went along with this weird coalition because they never actually thought they would overturn Roe.
Catch the car.
Exactly. They didn't think this would ever have to be operationalized and figured out, which is partly why over the last 20 years, you have, what is it, 20 some states around the country who passed these trigger laws
Yeah.
that said if Roe is ever overturned, these laws are automatically going to go into effect that would criminalize abortion. And some of them are draconian and
Yeah.
ridiculous. They don't
Zero
give
exceptions for
right,
anything.
for rape or incest or ectopic pregnancies. Is that the word?
Yeah.
Yeah. So like they're just bad laws, but they were
Yeah.
put in there because it was theater. It was just to win voter support, saying I'm harder on abortion than the other guy in the primary, and so you should vote for me. And it looks like they've caught the car, and now they're like, oh crap! Like this compromise between racist conservatives and libertarian conservatives. Now we actually have to govern in these states around issues of pregnancy and abortion and right to life and all that. And governing is a whole lot harder than just protesting. And that's what they're not equipped to do here because they don't have that robust theology. They don't have even a robust philosophy of the role of government in these kinds of issues because it's always just been stick it to the libs.
I also think people who are not in a more extreme camp of some of the people that you've described, I think a lot of people who are in fairly conservative Christian churches and communities just have a general sense that part of what it means to be a Christian is to be for the government having laws that restrict us from doing evil things, but not for the government doing kind of like more positive things, like a welfare state kind of idea that you don't want a big government or you don't want the government involved in kind of an artificial way. And part of that's a sense that somehow the market and the state are separate things and you need to leave the market alone and the state shouldn't intrude on it. And I do think it's important for people who aren't so extreme but do just have a general sense that that's kind of like a Christian orientation to recognize that not like that's not true, that the market and the state operate separately. There's no such thing as a market that's just like operating outside of the constraints of a human community that has laws for how we treat each other and
What about
regulates.
Bitcoin?
I don't know anything about that, and I don't even. That's ridiculous.
Crypto.
There is always a social and political system that's in place. Anytime you have a community, you just have regulations. It might not be codified, but you have a
Right.
sense of what's right behavior and what's not. So there's always interaction between state and market. They're not even really separate things. But also the state, even if you had that sense that the state and the market are separate, the state is always influencing what's happening in terms of sort of like the free actions of individual people. There's all sorts of laws that do things with businesses and individuals, and you're never in this kind of like free state of nature where you're just able to make your own decisions, and then the state comes and intervenes. And I think it's important for us to have more conversation, even in our churches, theologically, about what do human communities look like and how do they function best and what is our theology of government, because that's a general sense that we have, that we just shouldn't, the government shouldn't be infringing on anything that we do. That's just kind of a fantasy about how human communities work. That's not true, but there's really good theological reasons to not think that way. And I think that's a legitimate question that people have. Like that's a legitimate reason why people might be pro-life in a very limited sense, in that they want abortion to be restricted, but not more holistically. And there's ridiculous extreme versions of that, but I also think we should take seriously the people who that's just kind of the sense they have about politics that needs to change.
Do you think this it relates to the movement of Christians or evangelicals in particular on the legalization of drugs? Because for most of my life, the attitude was drugs are bad, drugs should be illegal because they're bad, and that's the end of the story. Anybody who's caught with drugs or who's addicted to drugs should be criminally prosecuted as a deterrent to drug use. But in recent years, there's been a growing number of evangelicals who are taking a more holistic and compassionate approach that says drug use and drug addiction should be treated more like a healthcare crisis than a criminal justice crisis.
Yeah.
And it requires treatment. And in some cases, we need to decriminalize or at least change the penalties on use of these drugs because we want to help people rather than just prosecute them.
Yeah.
But why don't we have that kind of attitude about abortion where, and I'm not talking about whether it's legal or illegal, but the understanding that for most women who pursue an abortion, there are a myriad of factors that could be alleviated with proper care and policy. But we tend to have this, no, it's wrong, it's illegal, end of story, and that's that, and we can wash our hands of it now.
I don't think we have a good theology of the difference between what is moral and what is legal. And it really seriously, I think, ends up just being a question of what community you're in. So I'm in a community that generally has sort of changed its mind about the legalization or decriminalization of certain drugs. And so I'm going to kind of see the arguments for that. And then over here, I have this different opinion because this is kind of what my community believes. I don't think we have a good like theological or philosophical foundation for thinking, how could something be immoral but still legal? Or how could something even be, when it comes to protesting, how could something be illegal but also very moral for me to do? Like, we don't have a good theology that relates those two things, and it shows up in
Yeah.
the ways that we just get kind of pushed culturally based on, I read an article or my community changed its mind, and I don't have a foundation that's helping shape what my
Well, like
decisions about those things are.
this is a bad example, but it's what comes into my mind right away. We believe adultery is immoral, and it has
Yeah.
devastating consequences for people and for families and for kids and stuff like that, but it's not
Yeah.
criminal. And in Christian communities, we want to do everything we can to support healthy marriages, and we want to do what we can to disincentivize adultery. And we even create systems of shame and
Yeah.
discipline around those who commit it
Yeah.
because we want to protect families, but we don't criminalize it.
Yep.
So
That's a little different than abortion.
yes, it is definitely different than
But
abortion.
we don't always have a good description of why.
Yeah.
But my point is, if you were tomorrow to make adultery truly criminal, it doesn't end adultery. You would still need all of those community factors. You would still need
Yeah.
all that support for marriages and stuff like that. Similarly, making abortion criminal tomorrow is not going to end abortion. You still need to care for women, give them economic help, make adoption more accessible, paid family leave, all these other things. So it's not as easy as passing a law or overturning a court ruling. People are complicated and they make these
Yeah.
moral decisions within complicated situations. So we need to address them holistically.
Yeah.
But that's hard, Sky.
Mm-hmm.
That's hard. And you have to, how do you fit that argument in a 5-second political ad on TV? Sky.
That's not my job.
Well, you need to figure it out because it's somebody's job and they're just going to say, sorry, can't do that, Sky,
But-
Katani.
Okay, politicians are going to do what politicians do, but part of the responsibility is for Christian leaders to do what they are called to do, which is,
what are we
hey,
told to do?
you are going to hear these soundbite messages from the left and the right on abortion. Here's what we want you to understand is we want you to be deeply formed individually and as a community into people who will care and love and support families, kids, women, including the unborn kids. And here's how we are going to mobilize to do that. We can have a conversation around what legislation should look like around abortion in our state or our community or whatever, but regardless of what the legislation is, here's our calling and here's what we're going to do. And those conversations are, I think, happening, and they are happening, but they're not, they need to happen more rather than abdicating that responsibility to just the political parties who one says it's right and one says it's wrong. And that's as deep as we go.
Right. Can we still go deep as a society?
Well, I don't know if we can as a society, but we need to as a church.
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay, let's wrap it up. Any last thoughts for our Patreon folks? Thanks for coming out to listen to this, Patreon folks. Really appreciate your support. Caitlin, do you want to tell them to do anything? Like marching orders. Give our Patreon folks some marching orders. What do you want them to do?
About this?
Yeah. Or anything else.
I was thinking while Sky was talking, I do think one thing that especially in our churches, but in our communities in general, one way to kind of embody this sense that it isn't just yes, no on abortion, that it's a holistic kind of approach to human communities, is to say, okay, I vote with these kinds of things in mind, with the things that I have learned from scripture and from the whole history of Christian teaching and tradition. And then I also volunteer over here. And then I also write a letter to a senator over here. And then I also get together with my small group and we volunteer in this. I just think churches are one of the few remaining kind of communities, I think, in the US that could have that diversity of opportunities. Like, we come on Sunday mornings and we hear a sermon that could really exhort us to have this kind of ethic in our lives. And then we go into our small group and we have an opportunity to practice that really well. And maybe we have someone who's a partner with us that we meet with regularly, a mentor of some kind that helps check up on our spiritual disciplines when it comes to this stuff. We have a variety of ways to both be formed to be those kind of people, like Sky said, but also to practice it at all different levels, nationally, statewide, and locally. And our churches could be good places to do that if we found areas of political common ground and got less afraid about talking about those things together.
Awesome. Do that, church. Okay. Thanks for listening, folks. Thanks for supporting us on Patreon. We really appreciate it. And we'll have more fun stuff to talk about next week. See you next time. Bye.